Provost Tim Marshall, Professor Alenikov, dear Alex, Ms. Juju Chang, dear students, dear friends. It is a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm extremely grateful as you are honoring me with this degree, and through me, the United Nations and our staff around the world. The new school is a special place. I am an engineer by training, and physics has been the biggest intellectual passion of my life. But I reserve my greatest admiration for artists, philosophers, social scientists, and those who explain the world and make it more beautiful. And I thank the new school for helping to uplift us and give meaning to our lives. And I think that no other place would be better than the new school for me to be able to explain our view about women and power and our very strong commitment to gender equality in everything we do. Now, dear students, dear friends, as a man born in Western Europe, I have enjoyed many privileges. But my childhood and the military dictatorship in Portugal opened my eyes to injustice and oppression. As a student doing voluntary work in the slums of Lisbon, throughout my political career, and as the leader of the UN Refugee Agency, I've always felt compelled to fight against injustice, inequality, or the denial of human rights. And today, as Secretary-General of the United Nations, I see one overwhelming injustice across the globe, an abuse that is crying out for attention. That is gender inequality and discrimination against women and girls. Everywhere, women are worse off than men simply because they are women. Migrant and refugee women, those with disabilities, and women members of minorities of all kinds face even greater barriers. And this discrimination harms us all. Just as slavery and colonialism were a stain on previous centuries, women's inequality should shame us all in the 21st. Because it is not only unacceptable, it is stupid. Only through the equal participation of women can we benefit from the intelligence, experience, and insights of all of humanity. Women's equal participation is vital to stability, help prevent conflict, and promote sustainable and inclusive development. Gender equality is the prerequisite for a better world. Dear friends and dear students, this is not a new issue. Women have been fighting for their rights for centuries. 500 years ago, Queen Nzinga Mbandi of the Mbundu waged war against Portuguese colonial rule in present-day Angola. Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, is often seen as the mother of Western feminism. And 60 years later, Sojourner Truth delivered an impassioned plea for women's rights while she worked to abolish slavery. The women's rights movement came of age in the 20th century. Women heads of state dispelled any doubt about women's ability to lead. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserted the equal rights of men and women, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women outlined the vision of gender equality. Today, young women like Malala Yousafzai and Nadia Murad are breaking barriers and creating new models of leadership. But despite these advances, the state of women's rights remains dire. Inequality and discrimination are the norm still everywhere. Progress has slowed to a standstill and in some cases has been reversed. There is a strong and relentless pushback against women's rights. Violence against women, including femicide, is at epidemic levels, and more than 1 in 3 women will experience violence in some form during a lifetime. Legal protections against rape and domestic violence are being diluted or rolled back in some places. And rape within marriage continues to be legal in 34 countries. Women's sexual and reproductive rights are under threat from different sides. Women leaders and public figures face harassment, threats and abuse online and offline. The policing of personal freedom and dress are a daily reality for millions of women and girls. From governments to corporate boards to award ceremonies, women are still excluded from the top table. Policies that penalize women, like austerity and coercive reproduction, are back in fashion. Peace negotiations still largely exclude women 20 years after all countries pledged to include them. And the digital age could make these inequalities even more entrenched. Dear friends and dear students, gender equality is fundamentally a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, and we have done so for millennia. The historian Mary Bird has identified the deep historical roots of patriarchy in Western culture. In the Odyssey, written 3,000 years ago, Homer describes Telemachus telling his mother, Penelope, to be quiet and to leave the talking to men. Unfortunately, Telemachus would not be out of place in some of my meetings today. Patriarchy, a social system founded on inheritance through the male line, continues to affect every area of our lives. We are all, men and women, girls and boys, suffering the consequences. Male-dominated power structures underpin our economies, our political systems, and our corporations. And even Hollywood fame does not protect women from men who wield physical, emotional, and professional power over them. And I salute those who have courageously spoken up and fought back. A hidden layer of inequality is built into the institutions and structures that govern all our lives, but are based on the needs of just half of the population. The writer Caroline Criado Perez calls this default man thinking, the unquestioned assumption that men are standard and women the exception. This has led to the biggest data gap in the world. Very often, women are not counted and their experiences don't count. The consequences are everywhere, from toilet facilities to bus routes. Women are at higher risk of being injured in a car accident because seats and safety belts fit default men. Women have a higher fatality rate from heart attacks because diagnostic tools are designed around default men. And default man thinking even extends into space, which is indeed the final frontier for women. More than 150 men have walked in space, but just a handful of women, particularly because spacesuits are designed for default men. No woman has walked on the moon, although women mathematicians played an essential part in putting men there. At last, we are finally celebrating the achievements of those women, including Katherine Johnson, who passed away this week. All too often, alongside violence, control, male-dominated power structures, and hidden discrimination, women and girls contend with centuries of misogyny and the erasure of their achievements. From ridiculing of women as hysterical or hormonal, to the routine judgment of women based on their looks, from the myths and taboos that surround women's natural body functions, to mansplaining and victim blaming, misogyny has been everywhere. Conversely, across centuries and cultures, words like genius and brilliant are used far more often to describe men than women, which is less surprising when men have made the rules and banned women from participating in it. The damage done by patriarchy and inequality goes far beyond women and girls. Men have a gender too. It is defined so rigidly that it can trap men and boys into stereotypes that involve risky behavior, physical aggression, and an unwillingness to seek advice or support. As the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie puts it, masculinity is a hard, small cage, and we put boys inside this cage. Around the world, men have shorter lifespans than women. They are more likely to be in prison and to use and experience violence, and they are less likely to seek help. We have defined men's power in ways that come at great cost to men themselves. Gender equality has enormous benefits for men's personal relationships. Men who share caregiving and spend more time with their families are happier and have happier children. On a larger scale, transforming the balance of power is essential, not only as a question of human rights, personal development, health, and well-being. It is critical to solving some of the most damaging and intractable problems of our age, from deepening inequality and polarization to the climate crisis. Dear friends and dear students, I see 5 areas in which achieving gender equality can transform our world. First, conflict and violence. There is a straight line between violence against women, civil oppression, and conflict. Trillions of dollars are spent every year on peace and security, but we should be asking whose peace and whose security. Interstate conflict makes headlines, but in some of the most violent parts of the world, levels of femicide, the killing of women, are comparable to a war zone. 137 women around the world are killed by a member of their own family every day, and impunity rates are above 95% in some countries. In other words, we have men waging war on women, but no one is calling for a ceasefire or imposing sanctions. And our society treats the female half of its population is a significant indicator of how it will treat others. Rape and sexual slavery are routinely used as a tactic of war, and misogyny is part of the ideology of almost all violent extremist groups. Conversely, involving women leaders and decision makers in mediation and peace process leads to more lasting and sustainable peace. The United Nations is committed to putting women at the center of our conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace building, and mediation efforts, and to increase the numbers of our women peacekeepers. Second, the climate crisis. The existential emergency we are facing is the result of decisions that were taken mainly by men, but have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Drought and famine mean women work harder to find food and water, while heat waves, storms and floods kill more women and girls than men and boys. And women and girls have long been leaders and activists on the environment, from Wangari Maathai and Jane Goodall to the Fridays for Future movement. But the impact of gender inequality on climate action goes deeper. Initiatives to reduce and recycle are overwhelmingly marketed at women, while men are more likely to put their faith in untested technological fixes. There is plenty of evidence that women are more open than men to reducing their personal environmental impact. And recent studies show that women economists and parliamentarians are more likely to support sustainable, inclusive policies. There is a risk that safeguarding our planet is seen as women's work, just another domestic chore. I'm grateful to young people, Generation Z, including many of you here in this room who are working for climate action and gender equality, while recognizing the reality of non-binary identities and solutions. Macho posturing will not save our planet. Gender equality, including men stepping up and taking responsibility, is essential if you are to beat the climate emergency. Dear students and dear friends, the third area in which women's rights and equal opportunities can create a breakthrough is in building inclusive economies. Worldwide, women still earn just 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. And the latest research by the World Economic Forum says it will take until 2255 to close the gender pay gap. How can I tell my granddaughters that their granddaughters' granddaughters will still be paid less than a man for the same work? the gender pay gap is one reason why 70% of the world's poor are women and girls. And another is that women and girls do some 12 billion hours of unpaid care work around the world every day, 3 times more than men. In some communities, women can spend 14 hours a day cooking, cleaning, fetching wood and water, and caring for children and the elderly. Economic models classify these hours as leisure time. Gross domestic product puts 0 value on anything that happens in the home. But this flawed metric is the baseline for economic decision-making, distorting policies and denying women opportunities. Women who do have an income are more likely than men to invest in their families and communities, strengthening economies and making them more resilient. Women also tend to take a longer view. Corporate boards that include them are more stable and more profitable. The recent decision by one of the world's biggest investment banks not to take a company public unless it has a woman board member was not made on moral grounds. It was financial good sense. Women's equal economic rights and opportunities are a global imperative if we are to build a fair globalization that works for all. Fourth, the digital divide. When a couple complained last year that the man's credit limit was 20 times higher than his wife's, despite her higher credit score, the discrepancy was blamed on an algorithm. But with women occupying just 26% of jobs in artificial intelligence, it is no surprise that many algorithms are biased towards men. Digital technology can be an enormous force for good. But I'm deeply concerned by the male domination of technological professions in the universities, startups, and Silicon Valleys of this world. These tech hubs are already shaping the economies and societies of the future with a huge impact on the evolution of power relations. And unless women play an equal role in designing digital technologies, progress on women's rights could be reversed. Lack of diversity will not only expand gender inequality, it will limit the innovation and scope of new technologies, making them less useful for everyone. Fifth and finally, political representation. Women's participation in parliaments around the world has doubled in the last 25 years to 1/4. Fewer than 1/10 of states are led by a woman. But women's representation in government is not about stereotypical women's issues like opposing sexual harassment or promoting childcare. Women in government drive social progress and meaningful changes to people's lives. Women are more likely to advocate for investment in education and health and to seek cross-party consensus and common ground. When the numbers of women reach a critical mass, governments are more likely to innovate and to challenge established orthodoxies. In other words, women in politics are redefining and redistributing power. It is no coincidence that the governments that are redefining GDP to include well-being and sustainability are led by women. It is simple math. Women's participation improves institutions. Doubling the resources, capacity, and expertise we put into decision-making benefits everyone. One of my first priorities as Secretary-General of the United Nations was to bring more women into leadership positions. On the 1st of January this year, we achieved gender parity, 90 women and 90 men in the ranks of full-time senior leadership, 2 years ahead the target date I set at the start of my tenure. And we have a roadmap in place to achieve parity at all levels in the years ahead. This long overdue change is an essential recognition of the equal rights and abilities of women's staff. And it is also about improving our efficiency and effectiveness for the people we serve. Dear friends and dear students, the opportunity of man-made problems, and I choose these words deliberately, is that they have human-led solutions. Thriving matriarchal societies throughout history and around the world show that patriarchy is not inevitable. We have recently seen women, many of them young, demanding transformational change. from Sudan to Chile to Lebanon, they are calling for freedom from violence, greater representation, and urgent climate action, and questioning economic systems that fail to deliver opportunities and fulfillment for many. We owe these young leaders our voices and our support. Gender equality is part of the DNA of the United Nations. The equal rights of women and men are included in the Charter, our founding document. And as we mark our 75th anniversary this year, along with the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Conference on Women, we are redoubling our efforts to support women's rights across the board. Last month, the United Nations launched a decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the blueprint for our partnership with governments to build peaceful, prosperous and inclusive societies on a healthy planet. And gender equality is a goal in itself and key to achieving the other 16 goals. The decade of action is aimed at transforming institutions and structures, broadening inclusion and driving sustainability. Repealing laws that discriminate against women and girls, increasing protection against violence, closing the gap in girls' education and digital technology, guaranteeing full access to sexual and reproductive health services and rights, and ending the gender pay gap are just some of the areas we are targeting. Women's equal leadership and participation are fundamental. That is why in the past I always supported quotas, the most effective way to achieve a radical shift in the balance of power, but now it's the time for gender parity in governments, parliaments, corporate boards and institutions everywhere. Over the next 2 years, I intend to deepen my personal commitment to highlighting and supporting gender equality in all areas of UN work. And I will contact governments that have discriminatory laws on their books to advocate for change and offer our support, and urge each new government to achieve gender parity in senior leadership. I will explore ways to maximize the influence of the United Nations to make sure women have equal representation in peace processes, and strengthen our work on the links between violence against women and international peace and security. I will continue to meet women whose lives have been affected by violence and advocate for GDP to include measures of well-being and sustainability and for unpaid domestic work to be given its true value. I am committed to ending default male thinking across the United Nations. We are a data-driven organization. It is essential that our data does not make the ridiculous assumption that men are the norm and women the exception. We need women's voices and contributions at the forefront of peace negotiations and trade talks, at the Oscars and the G20, in boardrooms and classrooms, and at the United Nations General Assembly. Dear students and dear friends, gender equality is a question of power, power that has been jealously guarded by men for millennia. It is about an abuse of power that is damaging our communities, our economies, our environment, our relationships, and our health. We must urgently transform and redistribute power if we are to safeguard our future and our planet. And that is why all men should support women's rights and gender equality. And that is why I am a proud feminist. Women have equaled and outperformed men in almost every sphere. It is time to stop trying to change women and start changing the systems that prevent them from achieving their potential. Our power structures have evolved gradually over thousands of years. One further evolution is long overdue. The 21st century must be the century of women's equality. Let us all play our part in making it so. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary-General. The urgent force of your speech gives us both hope and inspiration, so thank you so much. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce television journalist Juju Chang, who will moderate a dialogue with the Secretary-General. Juju Chang is an Emmy Award-winning co-anchor of the ABC News Nightline. She also reports regularly on Good Morning America and 2020. She has profiled a wide array of prominent individuals, including Oprah Winfrey, Chelsea Manning, former Vice President Joe Biden, and Sheryl Sandberg. She's delivered impactful reports on national and global issues such as sexual assault on college campuses, transgender persons in the military, violence against women in Honduras, kidnappings by the Boko Haram in Central Africa, and the Boston Marathon bombings. We are honored to have her here with us tonight to lead this discussion. Juju, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can all tell by the response to your speech, by the standing ovation, that everyone understands the critical import of your speech, and also the women in the audience understand that we need male allies, and you are first among them, so thank you. I want to start our question and answer just by previewing that we're going to allow people in the audience, hopefully students, to grab the mic and ask questions along the lines of women and equality as well. But let me start by getting you to elaborate on your goal, which you reached in January, of getting gender parity in the upper ranks of the United Nations, 2 years ahead of schedule. Why are you a fan of quotas, and how did you go about doing it so rapidly when in the corporate world we hear all the time, oh, it's a pipeline issue, we don't have recruitment, we don't have enough women?
Well, first of all, I do believe that the questions of gender equality are crucial for the future of the world. It's not only for women's rights. And I do believe that the main obstacle for gender equality is a question of power. Power, political power, but economic power and all other forms of power. And obviously, if you face an organization like the United Nations, the only way to change is to start changing by putting women in the driver's seat, in equality with men. When I arrived, we had about 115 men and 54 women, which means less than 1/3 in the Assistant Secretary-General and then the Secretary-General positions. And it was obvious that most of the more important posts, the posts that have, I would say, more power, were essentially led by men.
Fascinating.
Now, I believe that we needed to start from the top to make sure that we would be able to have gender parity across all levels of the UN. And we have a roadmap to achieve gender parity across all levels of the UN. In the top, I had one thing in favor, which is I could appoint people. And what I did was not to appoint people with a discrimination in favor of women, was just to create the conditions for women to have the same opportunities for men. And the truth is that in public administrations today, and the UN is a public administration, because of the fact that men are still very dominant in the private sector, if you give equal opportunities for women and men, you will immediately have women coming first in many of the panels that organize the selection of posts. And so I did not have to really discriminate in favor of women. I just had, having gender parity as an objective, to create conditions for women to show their value in an organization that, to a certain extent, was always a male-dominated organization, too, with a male-dominated culture, and where women had difficulties sometimes to just show their real value. And this worked. So we don't need to be, I would say, we don't need to be arbitrary. We just need to create conditions of equality, and we'll see women naturally shining in the especially areas like the ones as the UN, where the capacity of women in the humanitarian dimension or in peace processes or in questions related to inclusive development and the concerns we have with education, health and other, women have naturally a key inclination and a key capacity and a key role. So it was easy to a certain extent, just giving women the opportunities to come and to compete for those posts that traditionally were done by men, appointed and selected because they were men. For instance, now the Deputy Secretary-General is a woman. The head of the political...
She's here tonight, I should point out.
The head of the political department is a woman. The chef de cabinet, that is the coordinator of action, is a woman. And I must say, since we have parity, I feel that decision-making in the UN became much better.
That was my next question. Have you seen a change? I mean, you pointed out in your speech that it has a cascading effect.
It is very clear, because you have all perspectives. You have all different experiences combined allow for better decisions to be taken.
I want to follow up on, in your speech you talk about the digital divide and the fear that you have that in the area of AI, for example, that there is a big discrepancy between male and female representation, and that your fears that the default man will have yet another set of, algorithms that will be male. How do you change the shift in thinking? How do you lead in that arena? Because as we all know, that's going to have a huge impact.
Well, I think that unfortunately the problem starts in the university or even in secondary education. We must create the conditions to allow for more young girls to move into mathematics, physics, technology areas, where we have still a male domination in universities, and then the domination that is immediately multiplied when we move into the corporate world, and especially the startups, or as I mentioned, the Silicon Valleys of this world. There is a male-dominated culture in these high-tech areas that, in my opinion, represents the biggest threat for the trend that we have had in the recent past of increasingly moving towards gender equality. Now, if we imagine that, to a large extent, artificial intelligence and the digital world in general will shape largely our economy and our society in the next decades, this bias that exists today can reverse the present trend towards gender equality, and we must do everything possible, first, to attract young girls to technology, to mathematics, to physics, to these kind of areas, and then to act with determination also in some affirmative action in relation to open more opportunities for women in high-tech jobs, and forcing, to a certain extent, these high-tech companies to strongly commit themselves to gender equality.
I want to touch on the idea of the existential crisis, as you describe it, climate change, and you mentioned that it disproportionately affects women. It seems that we're seeing a lot of movement in the private sector, especially after the BlackRock investor, sort of put out that that should be a priority in his annual letter. And you saw Delta come out with a pledge for carbon neutrality. You saw Amazon's Jeff Bezos pledge billions of dollars. You've seen Microsoft do the same. How can you bring pressure to bear on governments and international organizations to do the same when the United States has dropped out of the Paris climate accords?
You gave the good examples.
Yes, I'm giving you the bad news. I said the good news.
We still have the fossil fuel sectors. We have the coal industry.
Right, absolutely.
We have the oil companies. So, I mean...
there's plenty in the corporate sector to be done.
And in those areas, we have already a few positive examples, but we still have strong lobbies against climate action. And we have also in the industrial sectors, even in agriculture, a lot to do and a lot to move in the right direction. But it is true that we see more quick changes in the private sector, especially the enlightened private sector, than in the political will of governments. And the main problem that we face today are the big emitters. And the big emitters are, to be clear, the European Union, the United States, China, India, Japan. And all these countries must commit themselves to carbon neutrality in 2050. The European Union is on that way, even if until now Europe has lagged behind in relation to its own commitments facing the Paris Agreement. But now the European Union, with the exception of Poland, but I think this is a problem that will be solved quickly, is committed to carbon neutrality in 2050, and the scientific community tells us that carbon neutrality in 2050 is an essential benchmark for the temperatures not to rise above 1.5 degrees until the end of the century. But neither the US, nor Russia, nor China, nor India, nor the Japan have yet to commit. And we have, until Glasgow, until the COP26, the intergovernmental meeting that every year discusses climate change, we have until Glasgow to put all possible pressure on these governments in order to commit themselves to carbon neutrality in 2050, which means to commit themselves to a very drastic reduction of emissions in the decade between 2020 and 2030.
And what's your most influential ploy in order to get your strategy to get them into compliance?
I think that we have two elements of pressure that I believe are now extremely important. First is the public opinion, is the youth movement, is more and more people that have understood that this is a real threat, not for the future, but now. It's not only the natural disasters that are creating havoc and with dramatic consequences and are becoming more and more intense, more frequent, and with more dramatic and devastating consequences. It is also the fact that public health is threatened by climate change. We have about 7 million unnecessary deaths because of the combination of pollution and climate change, especially in the big cities of the developing world. And so more and more people are convinced that this is an essential question. And when people are convinced it's an essential question, we see that impact in corporations, because those that work in the corporations want the corporations to behave, and though the clients also want the corporations to behave, and it has an impact on governments. It's very interesting. If you look at Europe, last year, or I mean, in 2018, most of the elections were disputed based on migration. In 2019, climate change became a central issue in electoral debates, which means that public pressure is making governments change, and that is why Europe has decided to be carbon neutral. But there is a second element that is very important. I see more and more an alliance with the financial sector and the asset managers. And I understand, if you manage assets, if you are a pension fund, you have to respond to the, to your people.
Yeah.
And it is clear that if you have assets in companies that are in fossil fuels, in 20 or 30 years' time, those assets will have no value. So to a certain extent, you need to get rid of them in order to protect your own value and to invest in renewables that now are the green economy, the economy with future. And so we are seeing, it's very interesting, more and more in the financial sector, even before the industrial sector, a very strong engagement in making sure that governments understand this, that regulations are changed, putting pressure on the need to have, for instance, no more subsidies in fossil fuels, to have no more coal power plants, to have measures that do not discriminate against the green economy. Because unfortunately, the problem is not the green economy is being subsidized. What we are still subsidizing is the gray economy, or the dark economy of the future. And these two things, public opinion on one hand, but financial interests on the other, are converging in putting more and more pressure over governments to act.
I want to get back to women and gender, but before I do, it seems that what you're saying in many ways is we need to be guided by science and by facts, and not what I'm going to bring up next, which is the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. There's a lot of science and there's a lot of hysteria, and I know that the World Health Organization is the lead organization on combating coronavirus, but I want your thoughts briefly on what you're hoping to lead in terms of ways in which countries interact, agencies interact, and how we move forward internationally in fighting
I was Monday in the emergency room of the World Health Organization, and I had the opportunity to have a clear picture about the situation as it presents itself, and it's changing quickly, but as it presents itself. First, we are not yet in a pandemic, or in a pandemic. I think it's the English
pandemic, right.
We are not yet in a pandemic, but there is a clear risk to get there, and the window of opportunity to avoid it is narrowing, which means this is the time to ask governments and all those that have an influence on these decisions to do everything possible to stop the transmission and to do it now. My concern is essentially about those countries in the developing world, namely in Africa, that lack the capacity that countries that are more developed have to put their health services effectively doing this job. But this is still the moment to ask for countries to contain the disease and to do everything possible to contain the disease, because we are not yet in an irreversible pandemic. But we also need to do it with two concerns. First is to avoid the stigmatization, which became a problem in several situations that we are all aware, and also to have a human rights approach to the way the disease is fought. And these two things, I think, are also, to a certain extent, a condition of being successful in avoiding the spread out of control of the disease. If the disease spreads out of control, we are going to face a very serious problem. The only positive thing is that the rate of mortality is relatively low, but it will have a devastating impact also in the global economy, and that will be extremely negative for us all, and will then have negative consequences, especially in the life of the most vulnerable, the most poor, and the less developed countries. So this can be another dramatic factor of inequality, inequality among countries and inequality among people.
I happened to be in Honduras doing a story about femicide and looking at sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and violence that results as a part of drugs and gang culture. Part of the problem, according to the experts who are looking at it, is the lack of accountability. So how do you, when you look at the issue of gender violence, look at holding perpetrators accountable across all boards, but also because the United Nations peacekeepers have been accused of sexual violence, gender-based violence. How do you hold people accountable?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, there is still a serious problem of accountability. I looked recently into the countries of the Northern Triangle.
Sure.
And if I'm correct, the level of impunity there is above 90%.
Absolutely right.
And indeed, we need to make a lot of pressure on governments, police, judicial systems, parliaments that make laws to make sure that femicide is effectively fought. And this idea that what happens in the family is a family affair is totally unacceptable, but it's still in the minds of not only many people, but in the legislation of many countries. So this is one area that is fundamental in our advocacy. We had today a meeting of our executive committee on femicide, exactly, where we adopted a number of measures that we hope will be a strong contribution to put pressure on governments to act on this. But then we have our own house. And in our own house, we have two kinds of problems. One is sexual exploitation and abuse of people outside the UN, not only by peacekeepers, by UN agencies. If you are, for instance, I was in UNHCR. UNHCR was, and Alex can confirm this, we were resettling about 100,000 people per year, namely to the United States, at the time much more open than today, but also to several other countries in the world. Now, those that in a refugee camp in a remote area of Tanzania or Kenya have the power to select those that will be resettled, and to be resettled, can you imagine, is a complete change of life, is something that people dramatically want. They have an enormous power over the refugees themselves. And so sometimes humanitarian agencies, and we have seen that in the UN, as we have seen in the NGO movement, sometimes humanitarian have their own situations of sexual exploitation and abuse using this power over vulnerable populations. So what we have is a system in relation to the UN in itself of zero tolerance, and we are trying to implement it with, we have now, I think, a state-of-the-art whistleblower policy, and we took another series of other measures in order to make sure that perpetrators are prevented to act and effectively punished. And with peacekeepers, we signed more than 103 compacts with governments, because peacekeepers can only be punished by government. Governments first need to train them, and then they need to be able to investigate and to punish those that do these kind of things. We have not the right to do it in a peacekeeper that belongs to an army or a police of a country. But we signed 103 agreements with countries, voluntary agreements, that committed themselves in relation to training in these aspects, sexual exploitation and abuse, in relation to investigation and to prosecution and I mean, punishment. And we have 68 heads of state and government that assumed themselves as champions in this. And we are having some progress. We see improvement in the way governments are dealing with this. And we are also taking some extreme measures. For instance, we have already more than one contingent of one country that did not prove itself able to change in this regard, and we just moved it out of the peacekeeping operation in which they were. So we need to act very strongly on this. And then we have a second dimension, which is sexual harassment within the organization. And there I think we have today a system that has, one key element that I believe is unique in the world. The problem of sexual harassment is the lack of confidence, and the lack of confidence in the investigation. People are sometimes afraid to report
if you don't have confidence.
why to report if nothing happens.
Right.
And most of the investigation units of different entities, and namely in the UN, are traditional investigation units more linked to fraud and things of the sort than to sexual harassment. They don't know exactly what it is, and sometimes they are also male-dominated in their culture. And as we know, that leads to... So what we did was to create a special unit of investigation of 6, by the way, women, experts in sexual harassment, and any complaint within the Secretariat, or we put this at the disposal of the agencies, any complaint of sexual harassment goes directly to this investigation unit. And this is an enormous deterrent.
Of course.
Because all the traditional bureaucratic procedures of investigations have been abolished. Any complaint goes straight to this team, and this team does the investigation. And they have 3 months to do it effectively.
And they've been empowered to do so.
And they've been empowered to do it. And at the same time, we have a line, a telephone line that is confidential, so people can report without identifying themselves. We have done a survey to measure the dimension of the problem that was very useful from the point of view of information. And we have now a system of register, because sometimes a perpetrator in one agency would leave the agency and then would be recruited by another agency. Now we have a system in which all this information is shared across the board. So sexual harassment will not be eliminated from one day to another, but I think we have now one of the most effective systems to deal with it in public administrations across the world.
That is impressive, and I have to say, it's hard to hold anybody else accountable unless you hold yourself accountable. That's clear. I have about 5 minutes left. I have 2 quick questions. One is, we've talked about it at length. It's all part of the development goals, but how much is educating girls and women a central focal point of empowering women and reaching gender parity?
I think that the most important contribution we can give to peace is to invest, and development.
And development,
peace,
yeah.
Is to invest in education, and in the investment in education, girls, because there is still a gap. We still have a serious problem, especially in the developing world, of a meaningful number of girls that have no access to school. And to invest in education, and education with quality, because unfortunately many of the educational systems we have across the world still, we see many students coming out of a primary school without being able to read or to make a simple mathematical operation. So quality education for everybody, for every single girl, is absolutely essential. And it is an element in which we also can contribute to fight some of the worst things that still impact on girls. For instance, early marriage. If we have an educational system in which young girls are retained. And also giving to the families an interaction that allows to fight female genital mutilation. A number of things that a good educational system and the fact that you have all girls in school can change some of the worst aspects of women's discrimination and violence against women that still exist.
My last question is a personal one. I don't know if the crowd understands that you have a commuter marriage. That your wife, commuter marriage meaning that your wife lives in Portugal and you live here.
I think she has landed in New York just a few minutes ago.
What role is having a woman, a spouse who is working? I know that you're the first SG to have a spouse not living here. How does that color the way that you see the role of women?
I mean, it's the worst thing.
And how's the whole commuter thing going?
First, my wife has a fantastic career. She's Deputy Mayor of Lisbon for Culture. It would be absolutely inconceivable that this career and the way she gives a fantastic contribution to society and to her own fulfillment, that this would be sacrificed for her to be here accompanying a Secretary-General or accompanying whoever else. I remember in my country I had some pressure at a certain moment to be candidate for President of the Republic, which was something I was not interested at all, because our President of the Republic is not like the American President, has no executive powers. So I really didn't want. But she told me...
You're interested in power, I see.
But she told me one thing that I would like to convey to you, because it's a very important testimony. She said, well, it's up to you. I don't think it's a good idea. It's up to you. But one thing I can guarantee, if you are a candidate, I will make my own manifesto explaining why I will not be a first lady. And this is a central question in our lives. I mean, we need to be able to think about what we do, but respect that our partner in life has her or his own life and his own fulfillment that needs to be respected. And I must say, it works very well. Of course, it's difficult because we are not so much together, but it makes the relationship much more solid and much more sound.
So much profundity in one statement. Okay, I'm going to open this up to Q&A. I would very much like to hear from students. I just have two ground rules. One is questions, please, not statements. And second, let's try to keep it.
But if someone disagrees, I'll be delighted to hear that.
And let's try to keep it on the topic of gender equality if we can. All right, let's start in the back. I see a hand up. Please identify yourself. Just raise your hands again. Sorry. I see a woman in the back there with her hand up.
Hi, I'm Saloni. I have a question in the climate change context. We understand forests are natural carbon sinks, but however, due to very loose definition of forests, you can see programs like REDD+ or California Cap and Trade, which promote carbon markets. Forests are converted into monocultures, and there are a lot of other effects that are happening, like indigenous land grabs and other environmental justice. How do you think we could much solidify the definition of forests in a way that it actually saves the ecosystems and it saves all the creatures that are also inhabitants of the earth?
Sorry, I'm a little bit deaf. I didn't understand.
You're a little bit deaf, he says. She wants to know about saving rainforests and redefining what forests are to avoid indigenous land grabs and other negative outcomes. How do we do that?
The protection of forests and the planting new trees. There is now a project led by the World Economic Forum that wants to plant 3 trillion trees in the next decade. The protection of forests is absolutely essential from the point of view of nature, from the point of view of the planet in general, but also from the point of view of climate change. Let's not forget that we'll have to have net zero in 2050 in relation to carbon, but net zero means that we will have some emissions, but we will have the sinking of carbon. The best way to sink carbon is, of course, through forest. Now, the problem is that we are witnessing, as you mentioned, land grabs, and of course this is particularly relevant where you have indigenous populations that are impacted by that and that lose their way of life. But you are having dramatic fires in forests, and everywhere. We had the Amazonia, but we have Australia, we have the Arctic, and particularly the Arctic is particularly dramatic. I mean, if you remember Siberia, but also Greenland and Canada, it is terrible because there the trees take much more time to grow, and this is dramatically. So we need to preserve the forest. We need to have legislation that protects the forest. We need to fight against any forms of land grab or economic interests that try to destroy forests in order to do different kinds of other activities that are also negative. I mean, have emissions. But at the same time, we need to have a very ambitious program of planting new trees in all parts of the world.
I want to get a couple more questions in here. Let's do this. Let's take like 3 questions in here so that we can do them rapidly. We have such little time left. I want to hear from as many students as possible.
Hi, my name is Andrea. What successes have you had in pushing the removal of sex discriminatory laws in countries with more conservative governments, especially when some of the countries with these laws signed on to the Beijing Platform for Action and other gender equality commitments, and yet their laws are still discriminatory?
That's a great question. Thank you. Can we just pass it? And I'll help you. The question is, how do you work towards enforcing sexual discrimination laws in conservative countries? All right, so that's one. A gentleman, we should hear from a gentleman, and then we'll hear from you. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Abdallah, a student here. It seems to me, well, thank you for the, thank you for the speech, and that makes us very proud to have you one among us in the new school, especially after the degree you just got. It's, well, to the power question, it seems to me as we are defending, or we are from a defense position when we regard feminism and equality of women. But how do you think if we approach the issue from a loss perspective? And what I mean by loss is by putting women in a less disadvantaged or in a disadvantaged position, there is a diversity, for instance, that we are losing. And you mentioned an example about how decision-making process in the United Nations get better when women get to a higher position. Second question is going to be shorter. When do you think we're going to have the next UNSG as a woman? And thank you so much.
That's a good question. Okay, when will the UNSG be a woman?
So the first was?
The first was a little, it's that women are, if they're no longer less advantaged, that there's a loss of diversity in the...
We are losing as a world, as a community, as business, as small communities, and also large communities. We are losing by the fact that women are not equal to men in many aspects. Can you say a word about that, about changing the strategy of well, it's a little bit complicated, so
okay.
I'm gonna.
Okay.
If I have a chance, I will talk to you after the.
Okay. Well, that's
speech.
I think we got it. Okay. Let's let the woman behind you have a quick word.
Sorry, I'm pretty shy. I think my question really is. It's not a question, it's more advice. What advice would you give to an immigrant woman in this country who wants to run for public office?
An immigrant woman?
An immigrant woman who wants to run for public office in this country. What advice would you have? And then let's do one more in the center here. Just pass that down and we'll We'll do one more, and then we'll let him do a lightning round. Hopefully we can get a few more. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lorraine, and I'm a student in the International Affairs program. I really liked how you questioned the categorization of housework and care work as leisure time. So my question is, how do you see the restructuring of the economy in order to better account for those factors, and what may be the challenges in achieving that?
That's a great question, too. Okay, let's start with
conservative governments. No?
Yeah, conservative governments, right.
It's true we are having a pushback in relation to human rights in many conservative governments, and there is only one way, is to push back against the pushback. So we need to be able to try to influence things, and there are many ways to do it, supporting the civil society, supporting the movements that can, to a certain extent, have a positive influence in those countries and putting pressure on the government, entering in direct contact with the government, and sometimes denouncing things if they are absolutely unacceptable. But there is indeed a pushback. We are seeing changes in legislation, namely in relation to violence against women, femicide, rape. It's not everywhere, but in some situations we are moving backwards, and it's absolutely essential to, as I said, push back against the pushback. When will the next
when will the SG be a woman? Yeah,
I don't know. I suppose.
Well, Amina's right here.
Many people were expecting that it would be sitting now here, but I apologize, but I couldn't do anything about it.
You don't have to be. Well, as long as you're a feminist, we'll let that slide. And what advice would you give?
I explained to people, if you want a woman, you have to choose someone else. That was very clear. But I think it is absolutely natural that in Secretary-General of the United Nations, or as president of a country, or as prime minister of a country, depending on the constitutional systems, or a president of a CEO of a company, we need to move into a situation in which women and men have equal opportunities and equal presence, and that we are able to overcome the difficulties and the challenges, the default man approach that still makes it sometimes difficult. No? The question of diversity is very interesting. I come from a country that has changed a lot, and I'm already 70 years old. But when I was a boy, Portugal was still under a dictatorship. It was a very Catholic country, very conservative country, and indeed very much more male-dominated country than what it is today. And I've seen the evolution of the quality of decision-making in political processes, and later in international organizations, but in internal political process, with the increase of the presence of women. And it's not only women, it's diversity in all its dimensions. A society like the US is a very diverse society. So it's not only a question of women, it's to have people with different cultures, with different backgrounds. So diversity is in itself a richness, and an extremely important contribution for not only good decision maker, but for societies to be more humane, better managed, and for people to be, in the end, happier. And this makes one think that it's the capacity to respect the difference. And this is what we're still lacking in many parts of the world. People need to not be afraid of what is different. People need to respect the difference and value the difference in a society. And we are not yet there in many parts of the world.
The next question was advice for immigrant women interested in public office.
Well, first, there are legal requirements that are different in country to country. So if you want to run for office, you need to, I believe, gain the nationality of the country. So my first advice is, if you want, if you want to have a public life in the country where you live, you need to become a national of that country. And then my suggestion is to be a candidate in a situation in which the electorate can understand the advantage of diversity from a candidate that is coming from a migrant community. And it's very interesting that in many circumstances, but you need to be smart in the way you make your choices. In many circumstances, this can be an asset. I recognize that in some constituencies, it might be a liability. So, but I'm seeing more and more, I know better Europe but in Europe, we are seeing more and more migrant people becoming, assuming very important functions. For instance, the mayor of Paris, Ana Hidalgo,
right.
is of Spanish, origin. And this is just an example. We could go on and on
Mayor
and
of
on.
London.
With so I think that we need also, all of us, to work to make societies understand the importance of diversity and the importance to give a voice to the different communities within the society, for each community to feel that their identity is respected, but at the same time that they are part of the society as a whole with full rights and full equality.
The last question was, how do you account for housework, caregiving in recalibrating accounting?
We have a model today, which is the model in which the concept of work is very much linked to, industrial activities or services or whatever. And no value is given to the work that is done, for instance, when we take care of our parents, or when, and I'm not only talking about women and men, or when we do the many things I mentioned when I spoke. And indeed, they are classified as leisure, even if they are effectively work. Now, I think it would be important to review the accounting systems in order to take that into full account, first. Second, it is inevitable when we look at what's happening with the digital world, with artificial intelligence, the concept of work is going to change. And the relationship between work, leisure, and other activities will also be completely different. So I think this will create an opportunity. And many of the things that today have no value will probably become the most valuable, because these are the things that robots probably will not be able to do. So I believe that the technological evolution will be our ally in order to make sure that those things that today essentially women, but more and more men are also doing those things. Those things that women do that the economies completely ignore will be an essential part of the way we look into the economy of the future. And probably the traditional work as we see it will almost disappear. It will be different. Even today, work is changing. The nature of work will change dramatically. And this, I think, will help to value those things that in which the human touch is irreplaceable.
I cannot thank you enough. Thank you, Mr. Secretary-General. It's notable that the world's top diplomat is an avowed feminist. I want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. It was outstanding.
Thank you so much. It's been a tremendous honor to host this event and this very important speech. You might not know, but there's a rather wonderful photographic essay of the 15 most powerful rooms in the world, including the UN General Assembly and rooms in Geneva, and this room is among them. And it's because from the 1930s on, we've hosted a remarkable string of very important speeches, but none more than this evening. So it's a tremendous honor, Secretary-General, to host you here, and thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.